Hi students, welcome back. This is Professor Bridget once again, and this is the second part of the female reproductive system. This will be the last part. We left off in part 1 learning about the uterus and the layers that make up the uterus as a hollow organ. And so that brings us to the uterine cycle. What happens to the uterus during a average 30-day course of time? There are some significant changes that the uterus goes through throughout that period. We will go back and revisit the histology of the uterine wall later on in the lecture. So the uterine cycle can be broken up into 3 main phases. And this slide, the text here is giving you some numbers. Just kind of beware that these are just average numbers, and the uterine cycle for every female will be slightly different. Okay, so that first, we count the first day of a woman's period or menstruation as day 1 in the uterine cycle. So on average, from day 1 until day 5, that endometrial lining is shrinking. And blood vessels are coiling up, or essentially pulling back and dying. Blood stagnates or begins to quit moving. Cells die, so the epithelial cells there die, and then eventually the most superficial layer of the endometrium is lost. And this is what you see as mostly a discharge of blood, but there will also be mucus and endometrial cells. And this is all under the control of estrogen and progesterone. Normally what happens is estrogen takes a dip, progesterone takes a dip, and this is what triggers the shedding of the endometrium. Somewhere around day 5 of that cycle, the uterus enters what's called the proliferative phase, and that lasts somewhere between 9 and 10 days. Again, this is an average. And there's a 48-hour resting period, and the phase is named because the endometrium begins to grow back. It proliferates. So blood vessels regrow or regenerate. The endometrium thickens, the glands reform and increase in size, and this is caused by an increase in estrogen. Following the proliferative phase, the uterus then enters what's called the secretory phase. And again, this is an average of somewhere between the 14th and the 28th, begins somewhere around the 14th day of the uterine cycle and lasts until somewhere around the 28th day of the uterine cycle. This phase should begin right after an ovum is released, or ovulation. What's happening during this phase is the endometrium is continuing to thicken, but the phase gets its name because the endometrium becomes secretory. Those uterine glands are now secreting glycogen, fructose, and glucose, all nutrients that will be required if there is a fertilized egg present and implanting in the uterus. Normally, after this secretory phase, or after some period of time of fetal development, it's not very long, it's a few days, the fetus will create the placenta, and then that is how the fetus will be able to acquire nutrients directly from mom. But in the first few days, I shouldn't say days, maybe it's a couple of weeks. In the first few weeks of development, though, 2 weeks of development, that's what it is. The first 2 weeks of development, though, prior to that placenta and that connection to mom being created, the uterine glands there are going to sustain that developing fetus. Nutrients required for that are glycogen, fructose, and glucose. The uterine cycle is often also referred to as the menstrual cycle, but the term menstruation really refers to the shedding of the endometrium. So the menstrual cycle, it can often be interchanged with the uterine cycle, although menstruation, the process, usually refers to that menses. So this cycle that the uterus undergoes, or these changes that the uterus undergoes throughout the course of that 28-day cycle, is coordinated by hormones. A couple of these hormones you've already heard about, and maybe a couple that you haven't. But there are changes in a hormone called luteinizing hormone that's produced by the pituitary gland, and that triggers ovulation. So it triggers the follicle to release the egg. Follicle stimulating hormone, that's also produced by the pituitary, and that's involved in maturation of the follicle itself. So remember when we were learning about the ovarian cycle and the changes that we saw occur in the follicle, how the follicle continued to grow and became filled with fluid, and then the oocyte eventually broke away from the wall of the follicle? Follicle stimulating hormone is what's responsible, or one of the things responsible for the changes that you see in that follicle during the ovarian cycle. Estrogen, which is produced by the ovaries, stimulates endometrial growth. So remember that the cells of the endometrium, the epithelial cells, are simple columnar epithelium. And remember, just in general, that epithelial cells undergo very rapid mitosis. Estrogen helps this cell division occur even quicker. So as estrogen increases over the length of the uterine cycle, that's causing the epithelial cells to undergo mitosis and regrow in preparation for building that endometrium and preparing that endometrium to receive a fertilized egg. Progesterone is also produced by the ovaries, and it's also produced by the adrenal glands, and that in concert with estrogen stimulates endometrial growth, and progesterone maintains the endometrial lining. So to better understand, I think the next slide, this is what we want to see. To better understand this, let's look at the thickness of the endometrium throughout the uterine cycle. So I'm going to use a green pen here. And in the bottom graph, what you see is the uterine cycle, and you see here there are days written at the bottom. So if we start at day 0 up to about day 5, all of this is the endometrium. These are the uterine glands. I'll just abbreviate that, UG. And then, of course, these are the blood vessels. And as a result of a decrease in progesterone, we see that the uterine wall begins to decrease. So the thickness of the uterine wall, or the endometrium, decreases. And this is essentially menstruation. So as those dead cells and mucus are lost, the endometrium thins out considerably. And if you look over here, let's go up to the next graph, and you see estrogen in red and progesterone in black. See what's happening at the very end of the uterine cycle, how estrogen and progesterone start to decrease. That's what triggers the loss of the endometrium here. And so on the earlier side, I said that menstruation begins when estrogen and progesterone are low. Yeah, these two hormones, progesterone and estrogen, they're going to kick off that menstruation. And then we enter the proliferative phase. And during the proliferative phase, remember, the endometrium is beginning to grow back. So it's proliferating. And so you can see how it's gradually getting thicker and thicker here. And now the uterus is preparing for the next month, or this coming month, where hopefully an egg will be fertilized, and then ultimately that egg ends up implanting, we'll draw the fertilized egg, we call it a zygote. Maybe that zygote ends up embedding here in the endometrium. So you've got a regrowth of the endometrium, specifically the functional layer, during that proliferative phase. And then the remaining part of the uterine cycle is the secretory phase. And what you also see happening here is that, again, the endometrium is increasing in thickness, the blood vessels are growing back, the uterine glands are growing back. But now remember, those uterine glands are secreting glycogen, which is like a long-term stored form of glucose, plus glucose itself and fructose. So those three nutrients are going to be crucial for this zygote, this fertilized egg, in the first couple of weeks during development. They're going to sustain that zygote. Okay, we're going to start with a clean screen now, and we've just gone over the changes that you see in the endometrium over the course of the uterine cycle. And I've explained the importance of this endometrial lining. It needs to be nice and thick and be well vascularized and have well-developed uterine glands in order for it to be the right environment for a fertilized egg to implant in. And we've looked at just what happens here at the end of the uterine cycle with regards to progesterone and estrogen kicking off that menses. But let's look at estrogen and progesterone levels now throughout the whole cycle. So, of course, during menses and during menses, estrogen is going to gradually increase. And when you move into the proliferative phase, it increases quite dramatically. And then there's a small dip during the secretory phase, and then it comes back up again and then drops to a point that's going to trigger menses. If we look at progesterone, it stays pretty stable all the way up until about the secretory phase, and then it remains high. But then at the end of the secretory phase, it also declines. So it's really this decline in progesterone and estrogen together that triggers menses. But estrogen and progesterone are also assisting in the development of the endometrium. So you're probably like, well, Bridget, what difference does this make? I don't see why this is relevant. Well, let's look at the changes that we see in the endometrium, the changes that we see in hormones, and then compare that to the changes that we're seeing in the follicles within the ovarian cycle. And this will make a little bit more sense. So during menses, you have the follicles just beginning to develop, right? And that's going to be under the control of follicle-stimulating hormone. So follicle-stimulating hormone is going to cause that follicle to gradually enlarge and undergo some changes. You'll see that there's this antrum, or this fluid-filled space right here that is going to eventually cause the follicle to rupture and cause ovulation. So right when estrogen is quite high and luteinizing hormone is also high, that triggers ovulation. But look what's happening down here in the endometrium. We're just right here at the end of the proliferative phase. So the endometrium isn't quite ready to receive a fertilized egg quite yet. But remember that ovulation occurs from the ovaries, and those eggs need to travel down the fallopian tubes, and that's where fertilization takes place. And then the fertilized egg, the zygote, makes its way down to the uterus. So that takes a little bit of time for that to occur. So there's ovulation that occurs, and then the follicle then becomes this structure called the corpus luteum. And remember, the corpus luteum is responsible for secreting progesterone. So you see how the follicle undergoes these different stages, or the corpus luteum undergoes these 2 stages right here, and then it becomes what we call corpus albicans. And that corpus luteum is, when it's secreting that progesterone, it is maintaining this endometrial lining long enough for that fertilized egg to make its way down the fallopian tubes, implant safely in the endometrium, in the wall, and begin its development. If, however, there isn't a fertilized egg, what will happen is, let me erase the fertilized egg. So, no fertilized egg present. What will happen is the corpus luteum degenerates into this, what's called corpus albicans, and corpus albicans doesn't secrete progesterone. So when there's no more progesterone being produced, you see what happens here. The progesterone levels dip, and that's what initiates the beginning of the next uterine cycle, menses. However, if there is a fertilized egg present, the mature corpus luteum, this structure right here, will continue to produce progesterone long for that embryo to create the placenta, and then the embryo will start making its own progesterone. And in that case, if there is a pregnancy, progesterone does not dip. Progesterone should stay pretty stable throughout the remainder of the pregnancy. And the job of that progesterone is to maintain this uterine wall so that a pregnancy can be carried out. If progesterone levels dip, then, as you know, that causes that endometrial wall, or that this layer, to start sloughing off. And if there were an embryo present, a developing embryo, and progesterone drops, well, then the developing embryo will be lost as well, and a pregnancy cannot continue. Okay, so let's look at the histology of the uterus during these different phases. So we lost some formatting here, but in this slide you'll see that phase of menses. So let's look at the layers here. Remember, with the endometrium, there are 2 sublayers. So there's the functional layer, or the functional zone, and the basilar layer, or basilar zone. So after or during menses, there's really only one layer left of the endometrium, which is here, and that's the basilar layer. It was that functional layer here on top that was lost during menses. So you don't see that here, that's been lost. And then the remainder of what you see here is the myometrium, the muscular layer. So upon menses, there's just that one sublayer left, the basilar layer. Now we would enter the proliferative phase, and what you see here is you're looking at the uterus is tilted off to the side rather than straight up and down like you were looking at on the last slide. And here you can see the functional layer, and that's in green. And then you see the basilar layer here in blue. So what's regrown and beginning to reform now is this functional layer. These are the uterine glands here, they're beginning to reform. And then right here, if we could increase the magnification, you'd see that simple columnar epithelium. And then it's difficult to determine from this picture that this is smooth muscle, but all of this is the myometrium, that smooth muscle layer. And then as we move into the secretory phase, all that you see right here, everything that you're able to see in this field of view, all of that is the functional layer. So that functional layer now is so thick that at a similar magnification to the previous slides, all you see is functional layer. And then the uterine glands are really easy to distinguish here. All of these little, almost like white squiggly lines right here, all of those are uterine glands. So you can see that those are beginning to reform. So now we'll continue with the next organ of the female reproductive system, and that is the vagina. And I'll use black here. So all of this is the vagina, and so that's located there immediately inferior to the uterus that we just spent so much time on. So the structure of the vagina is such that it's a very elastic tube. It has the ability to stretch, but under normal circumstances, the lumen is collapsed, kind of like with the esophagus. Remember, this is in a passageway to the external environment, and most passageways of the human body that are exposed to the external environment are collapsed unless something is passing through it. One of the notable features here that assist during labor are what are called the fornices. Fornix would be singular. Let me erase what I drew earlier here, and I'll show you the fornices. So there's one, that little pouch right there, and then hiding under the tip of the arrow would be another one. And so as the head of the fetus passes through, the cervix can kind of get tucked into these fornices and give the head and shoulders of the fetus a little bit more space to pass through into the external environment. Now let's kind of remember that the vagina is a hollow body tube as well. And so it's going to have a mucosa. It's going to have a muscularis layer, and it will also have an outermost layer that is made of adventitia, or elastic, mostly elastic fibers. So here's the fornix right here, although they're not as obvious, and we've lost some formatting here. And then this is the vagina, that distendable elastic tube, and then that leads to the external environment. Okay, and now we've reached the external environment, and that brings us to the structures that make up the vulva. And the vulva is the term for the external genitalia, the external female genital genitalia. So this region up here, this kind of it's really just kind of looks like a mound. It's a little larger than the surrounding areas. It's made of mostly adipose tissue right here. So that's called the mons pubis. And then there is what we call glans clitoris. That is very similar. In fact, it's a homologous structure to the glans penis of males. So that's this circular structure here. And then again, we've lost, shoot, I don't know why it does that. We've lost some formatting, but the prepuce, or the hood of the clitoris, is homologous to the prepuce of the penis, and that would be this little hood of tissue right here. There are two pairs of what are called labia. Labia is Latin for lips, and so, yeah, they're both shown here. The outer ones right here, just really flaps of tissue, those are called labia majora. And then the labia minora are these flaps of skin that you see here. This would be the vaginal entrance to that, that vaginal orifice, that entrance to the body tube. And then the urethra is this structure here. So you may be surprised to know or learn, but many people, both males and females, don't recognize that the vagina where a fetus and or menstrual blood comes out of is very different than the tube that urine passes out of. So there are two separate structures here in the female. One's a urinary structure, the urethra, and the other is a reproductive structure, the vagina. Remember, in males, the urethra in males was both a urinary structure, a tube where urine passes through, but also a reproductive structure, a tube where sperm passes through. Now, in females, it is very different. Okay, now we're moving on to the very last subtopic here, and these are accessory structures, the mammary glands. So mammary glands are going to be highly specialized or modified sweat glands that, instead of secreting sweat, secrete milk. And their structure is such that there are 15 to 25 lobes that all kind of encircle or radiate around the nipple, and they're open to the nipple, so the secretion comes out on the nipple. There's an area of pigmented skin around the nipple called the areola. What holds the mammary glands in place are suspensory ligaments that attach to the breast tissue itself, or attach the breast tissue to the underlying muscle. I'll show you that in a second. And then you have the lobes that almost look like the alveoli of the lungs. They're not made of the same tissue, but they look like alveoli. So they're glandular, so that they're going to produce milk in women that are lactating. And that milk passes to what we call lactiferous ducts that open to the outside. So let's have a look at this. So just as far as where the tissue is, here's the muscle of pectoralis major. So the breasts are superficial to that. They're mostly going to be adipose tissue in both males and females. The difference here being in females, you'll have these mammary glands. And they do kind of look like the alveoli of the lungs, right? These little sacs. Those are the individual glands, and all of those glands then are going to secrete that milk into these lactiferous ducts. And those lactiferous ducts are going to have a connection to the surface. Here are the suspensory ligaments in white. So you can see the suspensory ligaments anchoring that breast to the underlying muscle here. And then lastly, just to point out, here is this area, this pigmented area around the nipple called the areola. And then you can only see part of it, but there's half of the nipple right there. And that is the very last slide in part 2 of the female reproductive system.